And now let me see if I can get your last name correctly. It's Markopolos?
That's good enough. Yes, sir. That's what I answer to. Thank you.
There you go. Well, thank you for joining us this morning on the program. The Bernie Madoff story, just something that I don't think has ever quite happened in history beforehand, where one individual seems to have milked and taken so much money from so many different individuals. Has this ever been equaled before?
Not so far, but I'm sure it will be exceeded in the future. Crooks always get bigger, badder, and smarter. They learn as they go along.
Well, that's wonderful news. Thanks for that this morning. Well, let me ask you this: how did you come about in this whole line of blowing the whistle on Bernie?
I was managing billions of dollars in portfolios very similar to what Bernie was pretending to manage, and so I knew immediately in the first 5 minutes that he was a crook because those numbers he was showing were too good to be true for the strategies he was pretending to be using.
So was he coming to you with a proposal, wanting you to put money into what he was doing? Is that how you became connected?
No, he was stealing customers from me and from every legitimate asset manager across the country. But I'm Greek, and if you steal from a Greek, we come after you.
Okay. So you suspected something right away. Why? And how long had he been doing this?
He'd probably been doing it when he got into the business in '62. He probably started out as a crook. His parents were caught running a boiler room in Queens in the early '60s and were shut down by the Securities and Exchange Commission back then. So I think he learned it from his parents.
Now, why didn't somebody else really catch that he was doing this kind of stealing way before you did?
Because he was one of the titans on Wall Street. He was trading 5 to 10% of the daily stock exchange volume in the United States.
Wow.
He was a two-time chairman of NASDAQ, the computerized electronic exchange for the 21st century. He was above reproach. People thought he was so wealthy he wouldn't need to steal. But what do we know about white-collar crooks? They're greedy. It's never enough.
Yeah. So he obviously was doing some legitimate business at some point or through some period of all this, right?
Yes, his legitimate broker-dealer arm on the 19th floor was on the up and up. On the 17th floor, he was running the illegal Ponzi scheme. And he got away with it probably for, I figure, 46 years.
Well, and now explain this to the layman, what the Ponzi scheme is all about, how that works.
It's robbing Peter to pay Paul. You take in new money investors. You have to constantly recruit them so you don't run short of money to pay your old money investors. He was paying his old money investors about 12%.
Wow.
And so he had a constant need for new cash to come in, and he needed to wipe out continuing streams of new investors. And so he spread this scheme. The scheme was spread across 40 different countries, and he had well over 339 big banks feeding him new investors across the globe.
Has it ever been figured out exactly how much money he stole from people over all this time period?
No one knows for sure because the records may be not totally complete, but the bankruptcy trustee figures it's about between $17 and $19 billion that we know of. There's probably a few billion that we don't know of that remain offshore.
And was he doing something in particular with this? I mean, besides treating himself to a very nice lifestyle, was he doing something else with the money?
Yes, he was brilliant. He was paying over 90% of the fees to the big banks that were marketing for him across the planet, and that's what kept the scheme going. He wasn't overly greedy. There's a saying on Wall Street, little pigs get fat, big pigs get slaughtered.
Okay. And something that I guess maybe a little more unusual about this is that some very notable names were involved in the losses that were suffered.
Yes, he had wiped out Hollywood, he had wiped out Palm Beach, New York, and he also went and probably wiped out well over half the royal families in Europe. He had taken the wealthiest, most powerful citizens' money from across the globe, so he had no place to run or hide. And when he turned himself in, he didn't even bother fleeing to another country because he knew for him that wasn't a plausible exit strategy.
Was there any of this revenue that was recouped for anybody?
It is. Some investors, if you got in early enough and you were taking the 12% returns every year, you might have gotten more money out than you put in. And so about half the investors were probably in that category where they actually were net winners. And the other half just put their money in to grow it, hoping to see a return someday, maybe pass it on to their estates and to charities and endowments. And they got totally wiped out. They didn't get anything back.
We're talking with Harry this morning about Bernie Madoff. And Harry, you were the one that busted this guy on what he was doing. There were big names and big amounts of money. Were there small investors that also lost and that had no way of recouping?
Oh, yes. There was a lot of people that didn't have the money to lose. You didn't need to be a millionaire to lose money to Bernie Madoff. If you knew somebody that knew somebody and that brought you into the scheme, then you would become a victim. So I've met many people that didn't have the means really to suffer those kind of losses, and they're nearly destitute, especially the people that are in retirement.
I'm trying to think of the movie that had that whole boiler room scheme that got busted.
That was Boiler Room. It was called. That was the name.
It was
of the
Boiler
movie.
Room. Okay. And I can think of the couple of individuals, that desperately, went out on the limb and put their money in there, and then were losing it, and it was just going to ruin their whole life. And I imagine there were people like that. Did you hear any stories of, the results that people suffered in their personal lives beyond the financial thing, but the mental, what they were left with?
Yes, I've met many people that have had people in their families commit suicide. Other people have died of heartbreak. I met one individual, a very wealthy man at the time. He saw the news on a JetBlue flight flying into New York, and he told his wife. She didn't believe him. He saw the news again. He got up, went to the rear of the plane, and asked the stewardesses to open the door for him. He was going to jump. And, of course, they restrained him, landed the plane, and I actually got to meet him afterwards on the beach
Wow.
2 years ago.
Yeah. Now, you wrote a book about all this, a New York Times bestseller. It's called No One Would Listen. And that later on has now been made into this movie. It's called Chasin Madoff. Did you get some, through the making of the movie from your book, were you asked for expert input?
Well, it's a documentary, so my team and I are actually play ourselves in the movie. We're not really acting at all. It's a documentary. Now, there will be a Hollywood movie probably in a few years where they'll put hot women, fast cars, and things like that in there. But none of that really happened, certainly not to us. It was a very boring case, but very dangerous case as well.
Well, let me ask you this. Who do you want to play you?
Well, I'm looking for Pee Wee Herman. If you find him, tell him we're interested. He can play the lead.
And after all this is done, are you still an investor?
I am an investor, but I invest my own money, and I do my own due diligence, and I only invest in stuff that is safe, and, well, nothing is safe in the market, but something that I know the people that are managing my money are honest, and so I don't trust anybody's word on that. I do that due diligence myself.
Okay. It's very interesting, unfortunately tragic, as you mentioned, the suicides and everything else in the people's lives that were disrupted, and some of them ended because of this. Anybody else take the fall beside Bernie on this?
There's been less than a dozen arrests. All the people that worked with him and cooking the books on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in New York are facing criminal charges. Some of them have copped guilty pleas already. His accountant has already copped a guilty plea. He's facing 108 to 114 years. So there's a lot of people that have been arrested, but there's a lot of people that got away. In any white-collar scheme, we don't spend enough resources policing up the white-collar criminals, and they're the ones that do the most harm. We have lots of people policing the blue-collar criminals, the thugs, the violent offenders, but they only harm individuals. They don't harm societies. They don't bankrupt companies, people's retirement, and turn them into nothing. And so I think the white-collar criminals are far, far more serious offenders, and we don't spend the time putting them in jail. Look at the banking crisis in 2008. Not one CEO is in prison.
All right. Well, on that note, Harry, I know we've got to move on. You've got to move on. I appreciate you taking the time to share this with us. Look forward to watching the rest of the movie. Got started on it last night. It's Chasin Madoff. The bestseller is No One Would Listen. It's Harry Markopolos. Close enough again?
It is. Thank you very much for having me this morning.
Thank you, and appreciate what you've done. Thanks, Harry.